Maria Santos woke up at 5 in the morning, just like she had done for the past 3 years. Her small military bed creaked as she sat up and rubbed her eyes. Outside her tent, she could hear the sounds of soldiers getting ready for another day of war. Boots marching on gravel, equipment being checked, voices calling out orders in the distance. She reached for her radio headset on the small wooden table next to her bed. The black metal felt cold in her hands, but familiar like an old friend. This headset had been with her through countless battles. It had heard her voice guide artillery shells to their targets. It had carried her words across dangerous battlefields when soldiers needed help the most. Maria was 24 years old, but looked older. War had a way of making people grow up fast. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a tight ponytail that fit perfectly under her military helmet. Her brown eyes were sharp and alert. She never missed anything important. Her fellow soldiers said she could hear enemy movements through radio static better than anyone else in the army. The other soldiers in her unit called her Angel, not because she looked like one, but because her voice over the radio was often the last thing they heard. Before artillery fire saved their lives, when enemy forces attacked and bullets flew everywhere, Maria's calm, clear voice would come through their headsets with exact instructions. She would tell the big guns where to aim. She would guide the shells to hit enemy positions with deadly accuracy. Maria put on her uniform and checked her equipment. Her radio was a large, heavy machine that could send messages across many miles. It had dozens of switches and dials that controlled different frequencies. Most soldiers found the equipment confusing, but Maria understood every button and wire. She could fix broken radios with simple tools. She could boost weak signals when other operators gave up trying. Walking to the communications bunker, Maria passed groups of soldiers eating breakfast. Some nodded at her with respect, others smiled, and called out good morning. Everyone knew who she was. In a war where people died every day, the radio operator who kept everyone connected was incredibly important. The communications bunker was built deep underground with thick concrete walls. It was designed to survive direct hits from enemy shells. Inside, the bunker was filled with radio equipment, maps, and telephone lines. Red lights blinked on various machines. The air smelled like metal and electrical circuits. This had been Maria's workplace for 3 years. She sat down at her main radio station and began the morning equipment check. Each artillery position had its own radio frequency. She tested them one by one, listening to the voices of the gun crews as they reported their status. Position Alpha had plenty of ammunition. Position Bravo needed new radio batteries. Position Charlie was ready for action. Everything was working perfectly. But Maria had a secret that none of her fellow soldiers knew about. Before the war started, she had learned much more than just radio operation. Her father, Sergeant Carlos Santos, had been an artillery soldier for 20 years before he retired. When Maria was growing up, he taught her everything he knew about big guns and cannons. During summer vacations, her father took her to old military training grounds. He showed her how artillery shells worked. He taught her to calculate distances and angles. He explained how wind speed and temperature affected where shells would land. Maria learned to read maps like a professional soldier. She understood trajectory, mathematics better than most artillery officers. Her father made her practice loading different types of ammunition. Heavy, explosive shells for destroying buildings, smaller shells for hitting moving targets, special shells that scattered metal pieces over wide areas. Maria's small hands grew strong from lifting the heavy ammunition. Her sharp mind learned to calculate firing solutions quickly and accurately. When the war began, Maria wanted to join the artillery crews. She knew more about cannons than many of the men who operated them. But military rules were clear. Women could work in communications, medical support, or supply operations. They could not serve on the front lines with the big guns. So Maria became a radio operator, even though her heart wanted to be behind the cannons. Still, her artillery knowledge made her the best radio operator in the entire division. When she guided artillery fire, she understood exactly what the gun crews were doing. She knew how long it took to reload different weapons. She knew which ammunition worked best against different targets. She could spot mistakes in firing calculations that other radio operators would miss. The artillery officers trusted Maria completely. They knew that when she called in target coordinates, the numbers would be perfect. When she suggested changes to firing patterns, her advice always improved results. Some officers joked that Maria knew their guns better than they did. They had no idea how true that statement really was. Maria spent her mornings coordinating practice firing exercises. Enemy forces were quiet during early daylight hours, so this was the safest time for training. She would guide each gun crew through different scenarios, hitting targets at various distances, adjusting for changing weather conditions, practicing rapid-fire sequences for emergency situations. Her voice over the radio was always calm and professional. She never got excited or nervous, even when practice exercises went wrong. When new soldiers joined the gun crews, they quickly learned to trust the woman's voice that guided them. Veterans told newcomers that Angel's instructions could save their lives when real fighting started. By noon, Maria had completed all routine communications tasks. Equipment was tested and working. Gun crews were ready for action. Supply reports were filed. Everything was prepared for whatever the enemy might do next. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring the biggest battle of her military career, and that her secret knowledge would finally get the chance to save hundreds of lives. The first enemy shells began falling at exactly 6 in the morning. Maria was drinking her coffee when the ground shook beneath her feet. The concrete walls of the communications bunker trembled as explosions erupted somewhere above them. Dust fell from the ceiling and scattered across her radio equipment. Maria quickly put down her coffee cup and grabbed her headset. Her fingers moved across the radio controls with practiced speed. She needed to contact all 6 artillery positions immediately. The enemy was starting their attack, and her gun crews needed to know what was happening. Position Alpha came through. First, the voice of Sergeant Martinez crackled through the static. His gun crew was ready and waiting for target coordinates. Position Bravo reported the same status. One by one, all 6 artillery positions checked in. Everyone was alert and prepared for battle. Through her headset, Maria could hear the sounds of war beginning above ground. Machine gun fire rattled in the distance. Mortar shells exploded with sharp cracking sounds. Enemy aircraft flew overhead with engines roaring like angry metal birds. The battle that military commanders had been expecting for weeks was finally starting. Maria spread out her large tactical map on the table next to her radio. The map showed the entire mountain valley where they were positioned. Red marks indicated where enemy forces were expected to attack. Blue marks showed where friendly artillery guns were located. Black lines marked the best firing angles for each position. The first target report came from forward observers positioned on the mountain peaks. Enemy tanks were moving through the narrow valley below. Maria quickly calculated the coordinates and passed them to Position Alpha. She could hear the big gunfire immediately. The shells screamed through the air and exploded among the enemy tanks with a thunderous boom. For the next 2 hours, Maria worked harder than she ever had before. Target reports came in constantly from different observation posts. Enemy infantry was advancing up the eastern slope. Enemy artillery was setting up positions in the southern valley. Enemy supply trucks were moving along the main road. Each report required immediate action. Maria's voice remained calm and clear as chaos erupted around their mountain position. She directed Position Bravo to target enemy infantry formations. She guided Position Charlie to hit enemy artillery before it could start firing. She coordinated ammunition resupply for guns that were running low on shells. Her radio crackled with constant activity. The enemy forces were much larger than expected. Intelligence reports had suggested a small probing attack, but this was a full-scale assault involving hundreds of soldiers and dozens of vehicles. Enemy commanders were clearly trying to break through the mountain pass and advance into the territory behind them. Maria realized that her artillery positions were the main defense against this massive enemy force. Without coordinated cannon fire, enemy troops would easily overrun the small number of soldiers defending the mountain. Everything depended on keeping the big guns firing accurately and efficiently. She began using advanced tactics her father had taught her years ago. Instead of having each gun fire independently, she coordinated complex firing patterns. Position Alpha would fire first at the front of enemy formations. Position Bravo would fire 2 seconds later at the middle. Position Charlie would target the rear. This created devastating sequential explosions that enemy forces could not escape. The enemy commanders quickly realized that someone was coordinating extremely effective artillery fire against them. They began directing their own artillery and aircraft specifically at the mountain positions where the defensive guns were located. This made Maria's job much more dangerous and difficult. Enemy shells began landing closer to the communications bunker. Each explosion was louder and more violent than the last. The concrete structure shook so hard that equipment fell off tables. Light bulbs shattered and electrical systems sparked dangerously. But Maria kept working, her voice steady and professional as she guided return fire. At 10:30 in the morning, disaster struck without warning. An enemy rocket landed directly on top of the main communications bunker. The explosion was so powerful that it felt like the entire mountain was collapsing. Maria was thrown against the concrete wall with tremendous force. Her radio equipment disappeared in a cloud of smoke, sparks, and twisted metal. When the smoke cleared enough for Maria to see, she found herself in a nightmare. Her main radio was completely destroyed. Backup radios were buried under fallen concrete blocks. Electrical cables hung loose and useless from the damaged ceiling. The communication center that had been her workplace for 3 years was now a pile of smoking wreckage. Maria tried desperately to find any working radio equipment. She dug through the debris with her bare hands, searching for anything that might still function. She found pieces of radios, but nothing that could send or receive messages. The communication link between her and the artillery positions was completely broken. Outside the damaged bunker, she could hear the sounds of battle growing more intense. Without radio coordination, the artillery positions were now firing blindly. They could not receive target information or coordinate their attacks. Enemy forces would quickly realize that the deadly accurate artillery fire had become random and ineffective. Maria climbed through the wreckage to reach the bunker entrance. When she looked outside, the situation was worse than she had feared. Smoke and dust covered the entire mountain. Enemy forces were advancing steadily up multiple slopes. Other communication bunkers had also been hit by the rocket attack. The entire defensive coordination system had collapsed in a matter of minutes. She could see friendly soldiers taking cover behind rocks and in small foxholes. They were fighting bravely, but they were badly outnumbered. Without artillery support, their situation was hopeless. Enemy forces would reach the mountain's summit within hours and overrun everyone positioned there. Maria realized that hundreds of soldiers were about to die because the communication system had failed. Her fellow fighters were depending on artillery, support that they could no longer receive. The guns were still working, but they had no way to know where to aim them. For the first time in 3 years of war, Maria felt completely helpless and desperate. Maria stood in the ruins of her communications bunker and made a decision that would change everything. She could not repair the destroyed radio equipment. She could not contact the artillery positions. But she remembered something that might save the day. 3 weeks ago, she had discovered a weapons storage room hidden beneath the main bunker complex. The storage room contained emergency supplies that most soldiers did not know about: extra ammunition, medical supplies, and most importantly, a complete set of artillery manuals and range charts. There was also something else in that room that Maria had noticed, but never thought she would need: a set of keys to all the artillery positions on the mountain. Maria grabbed her helmet and rifle, then carefully made her way through the damaged bunker to the hidden storage room. The metal door was still locked, but undamaged. She used her emergency key to open it and stepped inside. Everything was exactly as she remembered. The artillery manuals were stacked neatly on metal shelves. The range charts were rolled up in protective tubes. But the most important item was hanging on a small hook near the door. A ring of keys labeled with numbers that matched each artillery. Position. Position 1 through Position 6. Maria had never understood why these keys were stored in the communications bunker until this moment. Now she realized they might be the only way to save her fellow soldiers. She studied the tactical map one more time before leaving the bunker. Position 3 was the closest artillery gun, located only 200 yards away on a rocky ledge overlooking the main valley. If she could reach that position and operate the gun herself, she might be able to provide the artillery support that her fellow soldiers desperately needed. Maria knew this plan was extremely dangerous and probably against every military rule. She was supposed to be a radio operator, not an artillery soldier. She was supposed to stay in the communications bunker, not run across a battlefield under enemy fire. But her fellow soldiers were dying while perfectly good artillery guns sat silent, because no one could coordinate their fire. The journey to Position 3 was the most terrifying experience of Maria's life. She had to leave the safety of the underground bunker and cross open ground that was being swept by enemy machine gun fire. Bullets whistled over her head as she crawled from one bomb crater to another. Mortar shells exploded close enough to shower her with dirt and rocks. Twice she had to stop and wait while enemy aircraft flew overhead, their engines roaring as they searched for targets on the mountain slopes. Maria pressed herself flat against the ground and tried to become invisible, until the planes passed. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. After 20 minutes of crawling and running, Maria finally reached Position 3. What she found there made her stomach feel sick. The 3-man gun crew was dead, killed by a direct hit from an enemy mortar shell. Their bodies lay scattered around the artillery position like broken dolls. But the big gun itself appeared to be undamaged. The 150mm howitzer was a massive weapon that normally required 3 soldiers to operate effectively. One soldier loaded the heavy shells. Another soldier aimed the gun and calculated firing angles. The third soldier operated the firing mechanism and made range adjustments. Maria would have to do all 3 jobs by herself. She approached the big gun carefully and began examining it the way her father had taught her years ago. The barrel was clean and showed no signs of damage. The hydraulic systems that moved the gun were working properly. The breech mechanism that held the ammunition opened and closed smoothly. Most importantly, there were still plenty of shells stacked in the nearby ammunition bunker. Maria opened the artillery manual she had brought from the communications bunker and spread it out on the ground. Even though her father had taught her about cannons, this was a newer model than the ones she had practiced with. She needed to understand exactly how this weapon worked before she tried to fire it in combat. The manual was written in technical language, but Maria's training helped her understand the important parts: loading procedures, aiming calculations, safety requirements, and firing sequences. She memorized the most critical information, then closed the manual and prepared to begin her impossible mission. Using binoculars from the dead gun crew, Maria studied the tactical situation in the valley. Below, enemy forces were advancing steadily up the eastern slope in 3 separate columns. They were moving slowly and carefully, taking cover behind rocks and trees. Without artillery fire to stop them, they would reach the defensive positions within 2 hours. Maria calculated the range to the nearest enemy column. 800 yards downhill at a 30-degree angle. She would need to account for wind speed and the downward trajectory. Her father's voice seemed to whisper in her ear as she worked through the mathematics: distance, elevation, wind direction, ammunition type. All the variables had to be perfect. She selected a high explosive shell from the ammunition bunker. The shell weighed nearly 100 pounds and was difficult for her to lift alone. Normally, 2 soldiers would work together to load such heavy ammunition. Maria struggled to lift the shell and guide it into the gun's breech mechanism. Her arms shook from the effort, but she managed to get it properly positioned. Maria made final adjustments to the gun's aim, took a deep breath, and prepared to fire her first shot. She had no way of knowing whether her calculations were correct. She had no way of communicating with other artillery positions. She was completely alone with a weapon designed for 3 people, facing an enemy force of hundreds of soldiers. But her fellow soldiers were counting on artillery support, and she was the only person who could provide it. Maria pulled the firing cord, and the howitzer roared to life with a sound like thunder crashing directly overhead. The massive gun jumped backward from the recoil, its steel wheels digging deep grooves in the rocky ground. A tremendous blast of hot air and smoke erupted from the barrel, temporarily blinding and deafening Maria. For several seconds, the entire battlefield fell completely silent. Every soldier on both sides stopped what they were doing and looked up at the mountain where the artillery shot had come from. They all knew that Position 3 had been silent for over an hour. Nobody understood who was firing the big gun. Maria wiped the smoke from her eyes and grabbed her binoculars to see where her shell had landed. Through the drifting smoke in the valley below, she could see a perfect explosion right in the middle of the enemy column she had targeted. Enemy soldiers were scattered and running for cover. Several of their vehicles were damaged or destroyed. Her first shot had been absolutely perfect, but there was no time to celebrate this success. Maria immediately began the exhausting process of reloading the howitzer by herself. She had to lift another 100-pound shell from the ammunition bunker, carry it to the gun, and carefully guide it into the breech mechanism. This job normally required 2 strong soldiers working together, but Maria had to do it alone. Her arms and shoulders were already aching from handling the heavy ammunition. Sweat poured down her face despite the cool mountain air. Her hands were getting raw from gripping the rough metal surfaces of the shells. But she could see that enemy forces were starting to move again, and she needed to keep firing to stop their advance. Maria's second shot targeted an enemy mortar position that had been causing heavy casualties among the defensive soldiers. She calculated the range and angle carefully, then fired. The shell landed perfectly among the enemy mortars, creating a massive explosion that completely destroyed their position. Enemy mortar fire stopped immediately. Word was spreading quickly among the friendly soldiers that someone was operating the supposedly abandoned howitzer at Position 3. They could not see who was firing the gun due to smoke and distance, but they could see the devastating effect each shot was having on enemy positions. Morale began to improve for the first time since the battle started. Maria's third shot destroyed an enemy machine gun nest that had pinned down an entire platoon of friendly soldiers. Her fourth shot hit an enemy supply truck loaded with ammunition, creating a spectacular explosion that could be seen for miles. With each thunderous blast from her howitzer, Maria was slowly turning the tide of battle through pure determination and skill. But the enemy forces quickly realized that the artillery fire was coming from Position 3. They could see the muzzle flash and smoke from Maria's gun every time she fired. Enemy commanders immediately began directing concentrated fire at her position, determined to eliminate this deadly threat. Bullets began striking the rocks around Maria's position with sharp, cracking sounds. Enemy snipers were trying to hit her every time she moved to reload or adjust the gun. Mortar rounds started falling closer and closer to the howitzer, showering Maria with dirt and rock fragments. The air around her became filled with flying metal and dust. Maria had to work faster now, knowing that enemy forces were actively trying to kill her. She developed a rhythm for loading and firing that minimized the time she was exposed to enemy. Fire. Grab shell, load gun, aim, fire, take cover, repeat. Her movements became smooth and automatic despite the constant danger. Her fifth shot destroyed an enemy command post, eliminating several enemy officers who had been coordinating the assault. Her sixth shot hit a group of enemy soldiers who were trying to set up another machine gun position. Each successful hit made the enemy forces more desperate to stop her. Enemy artillery began targeting Position 3 specifically. Large shells started landing dangerously close to Maria's howitzer, creating massive explosions that shook the entire mountain. One shell landed only 50 yards away, creating a crater big enough to hide a truck. The blast wave knocked Maria to the ground and filled her ears with ringing that lasted for several minutes. But Maria got back up, checked that her gun was still working, and continued firing. She was beyond exhaustion now, running on pure adrenaline and determination. Her uniform was torn and dirty. Her hands were bleeding from handling rough ammunition. Her face was black with smoke and dust. But her aim remained deadly accurate. By noon, Maria had fired 12 shells and scored 12 direct hits on enemy positions. Enemy forces had stopped advancing completely and were taking defensive positions in the valley below. For the first time since the battle began, they were retreating instead of attacking. The tide of battle was clearly turning. Other friendly artillery positions began firing again, encouraged by Maria's example. Even without radio coordination, the gun crews could see what targets she was hitting and began firing at similar positions. The combined artillery fire was devastating to enemy forces who had not expected such organized resistance. Maria's 13th shot destroyed an enemy radio truck, cutting off communication between enemy units. Her 14th shot hit an enemy medical station, forcing them to move their wounded to less protected areas. Her 15th shot targeted enemy officers who were trying to reorganize their scattered forces. But Maria knew she was running out of time. Enemy aircraft were circling overhead, looking for the artillery position that was causing so much damage. She could hear the engines getting louder as the planes prepared to attack her position. Soon she would be facing bombs and rockets in addition to artillery shells and machine gun fire. Maria loaded her 16th shell and aimed at the largest concentration of enemy forces she could see. She was determined to keep fighting as long as possible, knowing that every shot helped protect her fellow soldiers. The howitzer roared again, sending another perfectly aimed shell into the enemy formation below. Maria had been operating the howitzer alone for over 4 hours when she heard the sound that filled her with dread. Aircraft engines were approaching fast and low, different from the high-altitude planes that had been circling earlier. These were dive bombers, and they were heading straight for her position. Looking up through the smoke and dust, Maria could see 3 enemy aircraft diving toward Position 3 with deadly purpose. Someone had finally called in an airstrike specifically to eliminate her howitzer. The planes were close enough that she could see the bombs hanging beneath their wings, like metal eggs ready to hatch destruction. Maria faced the most difficult decision of her entire life. She could abandon the gun and run for cover in the nearby rocks, probably saving her own life but leaving her fellow soldiers without artillery support during the most critical phase of the battle. Or she could stay with the howitzer and continue, firing until the last possible moment, knowing that the approaching bombers would almost certainly kill her. She looked down at the valley where enemy forces were beginning another major assault. Hundreds of enemy soldiers were advancing up the mountain slopes, taking advantage of what they thought would be the destruction of the troublesome artillery position. If Maria stopped firing now, those soldiers would overrun the defensive positions within an hour. Her decision took less than 3 seconds to make. Maria grabbed her 17th and final shell from the ammunition bunker. This one was different from the others. It was a special high-explosive round designed to create maximum damage over a wide area. She had been saving it for exactly this type of situation. The enemy dive bombers were screaming downward at tremendous speed, their engines howling like mechanical demons. Maria could see the pilots in their cockpits, focused intently on destroying her position. She estimated that she had less than 1 minute before their bombs would start falling. Maria loaded the heavy shell into her howitzer with movements that had become automatic after hours of practice. Her hands were steady despite the approaching death from above. Her calculations were precise despite the exhaustion that made her entire body ache. She aimed at the largest concentration of enemy forces visible in the valley below. The mathematical problem was complex even under normal circumstances. She had to account for the downward angle, wind speed, distance, and the special characteristics of the high explosive shell. But she also had to do all these calculations while 3 enemy bombers dove toward her with their engines screaming and bombs ready to drop. Maria made her final adjustments to the gun's position and checked her aim. One last time. The enemy formation in the valley was perfect for the type of ammunition she was using. The high explosive shell would create devastation across a wide area, destroying multiple enemy positions with a single shot. The dive bombers were so close now that Maria could see the faces of the pilots. She could see the bomb bay doors opening. She could see the deadly bombs beginning to separate from the aircraft. In perhaps 10 seconds, those bombs would turn her position into a blazing crater and end her life. Maria pulled the firing cord for the last time. The howitzer roared with its familiar thunder, sending the special shell arcing perfectly toward the enemy formation below. The massive gun jumped backward from the recoil, its wheels digging final grooves in the rocky ground that had become Maria's battlefield. The timing was incredible and terrifying. Maria's shell exploded among the enemy forces at almost exactly the same moment that the enemy bombs began falling around Position 3. The valley below erupted in a massive fireball as her high-explosive round devastated the enemy assault force. The mountain above erupted in equally massive explosions as enemy bombs destroyed the howitzer position. For several minutes, both explosions created so much smoke and dust that nobody on either side could see what had happened. The sound of the combined explosions echoed off the mountain peaks like rolling thunder that seemed to go on forever. Every soldier on the battlefield stopped fighting and stared at the incredible destruction. When the smoke finally began to clear, the enemy assault in the valley had been completely shattered. Maria's final shot had destroyed dozens of enemy positions and killed or wounded hundreds of enemy soldiers. The survivors were retreating in complete disorder, abandoning equipment, and wounded comrades in their desperate flight to safety. Position 3 had also been completely destroyed. The howitzer that had dominated the battlefield for 4 hours was now a twisted mass of melted metal. The ammunition bunker had exploded, creating a crater 50 feet wide. Rocks and debris were scattered across an area the size of a football field. But Maria was nowhere to be seen. The enemy bombs had created such destruction that it seemed impossible for anyone to have survived. Friendly soldiers who had been watching the position through binoculars reported that the mysterious artillery operator had certainly been killed in the massive explosion. News of the unknown hero's death spread quickly through all the defensive positions. Soldiers who had been saved by the accurate artillery fire felt a deep sadness mixed with tremendous gratitude. Someone had sacrificed their life to protect hundreds of other people. That person deserved to be remembered and honored forever. The battle continued for several more hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Enemy forces were retreating on all fronts, their assault completely broken by the devastating artillery fire they had received. The mountain pass would remain in friendly hands, and the territory beyond would be protected from enemy invasion. As darkness fell over the battlefield, rescue teams began searching through the wreckage of Position 3. They expected to find the body of whoever had operated the howitzer so heroically. They wanted to recover the remains so this unknown soldier could receive proper military honors and burial. But the search teams found something that amazed everyone. In a bomb crater 50 yards from the destroyed gun position, they discovered an unconscious woman in a torn and dirty military uniform. She was badly injured but still breathing. Her pulse was weak but steady. Against all odds, the mysterious artillery hero had somehow survived the massive explosion. The rescue team carefully lifted the unconscious woman onto a stretcher and rushed her to the medical station. Only when they checked her identification tags did they discover the incredible truth. The unknown artillery hero who had single-handedly changed the outcome of the battle was Maria Santos, the radio operator that everyone called Angel. The same woman whose calm voice had guided artillery fire for 3 years had spent 4 hours operating a howitzer by herself under impossible conditions. The radio operator who had fallen silent when her equipment was destroyed had let her cannons speak instead, and its voice had been heard across the entire battlefield. Maria woke up 3 days later in a military hospital bed with bandages covering most of her body. Her head felt like someone had filled it with cotton. Her arms and legs ached in ways she had never experienced before. But she was alive, and that seemed like a miracle considering what she remembered from the battle. The first person she saw was Colonel Anderson, the commanding officer of their entire division. He was sitting in a chair next to her bed, reading through a thick stack of military reports. When he noticed that Maria was awake, he smiled in a way that seemed both proud and amazed. Colonel Anderson told Maria what had happened during the 3 days she had been unconscious. Word of her incredible artillery performance had spread throughout the entire army. Soldiers from every unit involved in the battle were talking about the radio operator who had become a one-woman artillery crew and saved hundreds of lives. Military. Investigators had studied the battle carefully and determined exactly what Maria had accomplished. Her 17 artillery rounds had destroyed or damaged over 40 enemy positions. She had eliminated 3 enemy command posts, 2 radio stations, 6 machine gun nests, 4 mortar positions, and countless individual soldiers and vehicles. But the numbers only told part of the story. Maria's accurate artillery fire had forced the entire enemy assault to stop and retreat. Without her intervention, enemy forces would have broken through the mountain pass and advanced deep into friendly territory. Thousands of soldiers and civilians would have been killed or captured. Colonel Anderson explained that Maria had been recommended for the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration for valor in combat. She would be the first woman to receive this award for direct combat action. Her name would be recorded in military history alongside the greatest heroes of the war. More importantly, Maria's actions had led to immediate changes in military policy. Regulations that prevented qualified women from serving in combat artillery positions had been quietly modified. Maria herself had been offered the first official assignment as a female artillery operator if she wanted to accept it when she recovered from her injuries. During the following weeks, Maria's hospital room became a popular destination for visiting soldiers. Veterans from the mountain battle came to thank the woman who had saved their lives. Artillery crews came to meet the radio operator who understood their weapons better than most professional gunners. Officers came to study her techniques and learn from her experience. Maria learned that her father had been notified about her injuries and her heroic actions. Sergeant Carlos Santos had traveled hundreds of miles to visit his daughter in the hospital. When he arrived, he looked at Maria with tears in his eyes and told her how proud he was of everything she had accomplished. Her father finally understood why he had felt compelled to teach Maria about artillery weapons during those summer training sessions years ago. He had been preparing her for a moment that neither of them could have predicted. His knowledge, combined with Maria's natural intelligence and courage, had created a soldier capable of changing the course of an entire battle. Maria recovered from her injuries. She received letters from soldiers throughout the army. Many were from men who had been saved by her artillery fire during the mountain battle. Others were from women who were inspired by her example and wanted to pursue military careers that had previously been closed to them. One letter that particularly moved Maria came from the family of Sergeant Martinez, the artillery crew leader from Position Alpha. They thanked her for the coordination and support she had provided during countless battles over 3 years. They said their son had often talked about Angel, the radio operator whose voice kept everyone safe. After 2 months in the hospital, Maria was fully recovered and ready to return to active duty. She had been promoted to sergeant and officially assigned to lead an artillery crew at a new defensive position. She would be the first woman in military history to hold such a position, but she would not be the last. Maria's example had opened doors for dozens of other qualified women who wanted to serve in combat roles. The military had discovered that traditional gender restrictions had prevented them from using the full talents and abilities of their personnel. Women like Maria could contribute to the war effort in ways that nobody had previously imagined. The mountain pass where Maria had made her heroic stand was designated as a historical battlefield. Position 3, where she had operated the howitzer alone for 4 hours, was preserved as a memorial site. A simple stone marker was placed there, with an inscription that read, "Here stood a soldier who understood that true communication sometimes requires actions rather than words." Years after the war ended, Maria continued to serve in the artillery corps and trained many new soldiers in the proper operation of field guns and howitzers. She never forgot the lessons her father had taught her, and she passed those lessons on to the next generation of artillery specialists. Veterans of the mountain battle would often gather on the anniversary of that day to remember their fallen comrades and celebrate their victory. Maria always attended these reunions, but she never considered herself the hero of the story. She insisted that every soldier who fought that day had shown courage and dedication. But the other veterans knew better. They understood that without Maria's decision to abandon her destroyed radio and operate the howitzer alone, the battle would have been lost, and many of them would have died. They made sure that her story was told accurately and completely so that future generations would understand what one determined soldier could accomplish when duty called. Maria's legacy extended far beyond that single battle. She had proven that heroism comes in many forms, and that the most important qualification for courage is not gender or size, but the willingness to act when others are depending on you. Her story became an inspiration for anyone who faced impossible odds and had to decide whether to give up or keep fighting. The radio operator who became an artillery hero had shown that sometimes the greatest communication happens not through words, but through actions that speak louder than any voice could ever carry across a battlefield.